Recall that a construction project's timeline, from start to finish, has a midsection that will experience documents that occur on a repetitive basis. On the front end, we have several documents that are executed on a singular basis. Similarly, on the back end, we've got closeout documents, and many of those happen on a singular basis as well. Let's focus on the singular documents that happen on the front end of the job in a startup phase. And to show this at a different scale, we'll recreate the startup timeline. Of all of the documents that are executed during this phase, the one on which most of the others will depend is the proposal, or the bid. So let's establish that the proposal happened at this moment in time. And from there, we'll take our list of document activities and put them along the timeline to understand the sequencing of the events. One of the first things to consider are the bonding requirements. And you'll notice that I've left a little bit of a gap in the timeline, and I'll put this symbol in to infer the passage of time. Somewhere along the way, months or even years ago, an indemnity agreement between the surety and contractor was executed that established the surety's willingness to bond. Then, for this specific project, if the contractor was interested in pursuing the job, then there would have been some type of application that was provided to the bonding company to confirm that the surety was willing to underwrite for that particular job. And as far as the time lapse before the bid proposal, that's a function of the size of the job. For a large job, it would have happened much earlier based on the amount of work required to pursue the project. On many projects, there would be some sort of qualification process that has to occur. And remember, this is for owners and/or the design team to determine which contractors are suitable or have the appropriate resources to undertake the project. You'll notice that this represents a fair amount of time, because if a contractor was going to be found not qualified to pursue that job, then he would not want to spend the resources on putting an estimate or proposal together. Once the bonding company agreed to underwrite the project and the qualification process occurs, then largely what's happening at this phase of the project is the assembly of the estimate. And then as it gets closer to the time to submit the proposal or the bid, then the contractor would need to secure the bid bond, which would typically need a power of attorney document to accompany it if it were executed by the agent on behalf of the surety. This passage of time here could be as short as a day, but probably not longer than a few days, because the surety would not want to issue the bid bond too early in the process until they have an idea of what the proposal amount is. From this point forward, all of the documents that we're going to look at are a function of whether the contractor was successful in its bid proposal. And there's a little bit of subjectivity based on which documents have to happen. But one thing's for sure: if the contractor is successful and the owner intends to award the project to them, that there would be some type of contract or agreement that is issued. In some cases, the contract or agreement is executed relatively soon after the proposal has been submitted, and this may be the only document that is necessary for the contractor to get started. If it's going to take a certain amount of time for the contract to be written and executed, then there could be a letter of intent that is issued. Basically, this is a way for the owner to demonstrate intent and is a form of commitment to the contractor so that the contractor can allocate resources appropriately. Another type of document that could be issued, although not always, is a notice to proceed. This is a document that's issued that allows the contractor to actually proceed with work on the site, and more importantly, to spend money associated with the contract. If the notice to proceed were issued here, and a contractor incurred expenses, then even though the contract is forthcoming, the contractor has assurance that he can get reimbursed for those costs. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we don't have to have a notice to proceed or a letter of intent, but depending on how things work out contractually, you could have either or both. Another situation is where the notice to proceed could be issued after the contract has been executed. In other words, perhaps we've agreed on the scope of work, the amount of time, and how much the contractor will get paid, but for some reason, the contractor still needs to wait on a notice to proceed from the owner before they actually go onto the site and perform any work. So basically, we could have one of several situations. We could have a situation where there is a contract only, and that contract serves inherently as the notice to proceed and the intent. You could have a situation where a letter of intent was issued prior to the contract, which, again, demonstrates a commitment to the contractor. You could have a notice to proceed prior to the contract, which basically instructs the contractor to proceed on site, or the notice to proceed could be after the contract is issued, which, again, would be because the contractor was not to mobilize the job at the time the contract is executed. And keep in mind that depending on whether a notice to proceed is issued before or after, there may or may not be a need for a letter of intent. For the discussion of the last couple of documents, we'll presume that there is a letter of intent and a notice to proceed. At some point, the owner is going to require payment and performance bonds. Remember, we said that this was a project that required bonding, and so these bonds would then be issued. Keep in mind that this would require a premium to be paid by the contractor, so typically the contractor would not secure the payment and performance bonds until he had some form of assurance that he had the project, either through the contract agreement or notice to proceed itself. Another document procured in this phase, we'll put this at the bottom here, is the building permit. Somewhere in the overall startup process, the permit would be filed for and secured. This can be a little bit subjective in its timing, in that typically there is a plan check fee associated with this activity. So if the contractor is going to secure the permit, he would typically not do so until after a commitment had been made for him for the project. This is all a function of the fact that the permit costs money to obtain. In some cases, although not very often, the owner or the architect is allowed to pull the permit. Most states require contractors to be licensed, which is a requirement to pull the permit. In exceptional instances where the permit could be obtained by the owner, then it could actually be issued prior to a commitment to the contractor. And then finally, after some commitment has been made to the contractor, then we would see the submission of several startup documents, including insurance certificates, project schedules, and so forth. These could be submitted before or after the issuance of the bonds, but in any event would likely not occur until after the contract was executed or a notice to proceed was issued. And then finally, earlier we saw that a power of attorney document would be required to accompany the bid bond. Similarly, it would also be required associated with the issuance of the payment and performance bonds.